Holy God, may these words and all of our meditations be pleasing in your sight, for you are our rock, our Redeemer. Amen. When the pandemic hit, do you remember how everything stopped, right? Everything. We even wrote poems about how the dolphins came back to the canals in Venice. Does anybody even know if that was true? It sounded good. We learned how to Zoom. We bought ring lights if you had to record a lot. We went for daily walks for our health, where we saw no one and avoided them if we did. I know one woman whose work during this time shifted to her living room. Actually, I know many women whose work shifted to their living room. Her work, which had been so public, interacting with folks, helping them find what they need, anticipating what they might need, it became very solitary all of a sudden. There was just enough interaction, chat boxes, helpline phone calls, Teams meetings, to feel deeply connected still without ever leaving her couch, particularly in that early time. There was creativity, learning how to provide support in new ways. There was excitement, learning some coding even, all while cuddled with the dog. As it wore on, though, the screen started to wear, didn't they? And the living room office was less and less about the work than the couch. And the screen in front of you was less and less about the work than it was about Facebook Messenger or Instagrams or increasingly anxious memes about just surviving the day without hating everyone. Within the year, everything was getting on her nerves. She was tired of the work. Her boss, who she had adored before, was driving her up the wall. The work team was frazzled and grumpy. So when the note came to her to talk about early retirement, she called right up, and then she took it. More time for the grandkids and yoga class and reading, and when it started up again, she was hoping to do theater. But the grandkids weren't super close, and flying is really expensive. And the knee that had been bothering her pre-pandemic suddenly made yoga impossible. And by the time theater started up again, she was different somehow. Happier in her little life, or more contained by it. She is still to this day happy with her choice. She sleeps in late, watches Good Morning America every day. She putters around the house, which is appearing more and more cluttered, and she spends hours with her hobbies: a paint-by-number app, Facebook Messenger, knitting, a social web game where you competitively design rooms. Do you know that one? Louise Penny books, obsessively reading MSNBC and the local paper, articles from which she posts constantly to widespread support from her network. She got her knee fixed, but now it's the rehab that keeps her immobile. And she still has her groceries delivered. She likes it that way. It's more convenient. The dog died, which was hard, and she's not ready to get a new one. It's still too painful, and she's going to travel, you know. She just hasn't yet. She's happy, though. Ask her, and she's fine. She loves being alone. Call mid-afternoon, however, and she's likely to be taking a nap. Now, he spends a good deal of his time angry at the state of the world, at the state of the state. All around him, the state is getting more and more solid in its support for the other side. His parents, oh God, his parents, he can't even think about it. He does not understand how they could vote for such an idiot. So he forwards them articles, of course. If they would just read them, they would understand. Now, he hasn't lost relationships over this. Not really. He did have to stop playing golf with that one buddy from work after 2016. It just wasn't fun anymore. But mostly his county all votes the same way. It's a landslide every election, so it's not like he can do anything about this, right? Other than be angry. And the local politicians, though, he's not sure what they're up to. His city councilwoman is his friend, but he's still not sure how they let the situation get like this. Everything is so expensive. The downtown seems to be collapsing. Why aren't they doing something to support the local businesses? And climate change, it keeps him up at night. How folks think we're going to get out of it in the same way we got into this mess. Don't get him started on Israel and Gaza. He visited once, so he understands it better than a lot of folks. It's complicated, of course, but there's really only one way out. It's just infuriating, all of it. Sad and infuriating. Now, this morning's scripture tells us about a woman who is alone, right? You don't fetch water at noon. It is way too hot. You only do that if you don't want to see anyone. 5 husbands and a new partner in the 1st century? Either everyone she married had died, which is suspicious, or she had been divorced 5 times for being difficult, which probably means she was just being herself instead of who she was expected to be. You can imagine, right? The stigma even now. Think about then. And having gone out of her way to be alone for her most basic chores, the things she has to do, she hikes up to the well in the heat and she sees him there lounging in the shade. Can you imagine how weary she must have been in that moment, having hiked up to the well? And she wasn't supposed to continue, If he was there, she was supposed to turn around. She wasn't supposed to be alone with a man, and from the looks of his clothing, it was clear he wasn't from there. He was most likely a Jew, so she was definitely not supposed to be alone with him. So there had to be a calculus that went on in her head. Either she comes back later, does it all again, or she endures what will probably be a painful encounter that gets her in even more trouble. How exhausting, right? How lonely she must have been. Now, over the course of this Lent, we are looking at belonging, as we've talked about. What is it? How do we achieve it? How do we create it for others? We've talked about the ways in which it is rooted in self-knowledge, the love of yourself, your whole self, not just the parts that you show to the world. We've talked about dropping the acts, right? The masks we put on to fit in. We've talked about belonging fully to ourselves, which it means embracing our God-given and God-loved self, and how it allows us to belong anywhere and stand alone in the wilderness when our values require it. Today we talk about the why. And it's simple, actually. Because if we don't talk about it, it will kill us. The Surgeon General says regularly feeling lonely is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. 15 a day. It increases your chance of dying early by 45%. Alcoholism is only 30%, by the way. And 61% of Americans feel it. That ache will wear you down. Despite living in increasingly geographically, politically segregated areas, surrounding ourselves with media that tells us we are right, we are profoundly alone. Now, whether it's the deep, hot, searing pain of walking into a room and feeling unseen and unimportant or like you don't belong, or whether it's the slow, almost invisible grind of daily isolation, either way, unless we do something, surround ourselves with other people, we will die. It's been increasing steadily since the 70s, so it's not just the pandemic, it's not just the devices, it's not just increasing access to media, although all of those things have accelerated the rise. It's also the disintegration of social events and clubs, the increased geographical mobility, and the rising hours we spend at work. Even college kids who live in dorms are reporting similar rates of loneliness, right around 60%. Think about what you do in a grocery store. I think most of us know that talking to strangers makes you happy. It makes you happier. There's lots of studies to support that. Random interactions on subways, on buses, at the street corner, in the supermarket. No one wants to do them, and everyone feels better after they do. Lots of studies, but we don't do it, right? In the grocery store, if we don't have our groceries delivered, we look at our phones, we read the magazines, or we go through the self-checkout, even though we proclaim to hate that it's taking away jobs. It's just more efficient, and we have time that's precious. Every day, we make choices that isolate us. All of us do. The little ones and the big ones. Our circles are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And if we're going to talk about belonging, we're going to have to talk about making choices that put ourselves out there, that make us uncomfortable, that bumps us up against people we don't agree with, and that will, in the end, actually make us happier. Can you imagine how tired that Samaritan woman must have been just to keep going when she saw him there, to say, to heck with it, and just to continue up the well? Despite the stranger sitting there, despite the potential harassment it would get her. And then he had the nerve to ask something of her, prolonging the encounter, and she responds, "What are you doing asking something of me?" That's pretty much exactly what she says. "I'm a woman and a Samaritan, can we just get this over with?" Everything should have kept that conversation from happening. Their genders, their ethnicities, all the social rules, the time of day even, but she is brave or tired maybe, or maybe that's the same thing. And so she answers him when he persists. He is able to draw her out of herself and into a conversation about what it means to be holy and faithful and good. And he even tests her a little. Go get your husband. We'll continue this in a more proper way. And instead of simply leaving, she's honest. She says, I can't do that. And every time people tell me that Jesus is punitive, I think of this encounter. He tells her he knows. He essentially thanks her for her honesty, you've told the truth, and then leaves it at that. No punishment, no drawn-out discussion of ethics, no shame. Just, sure, I see you, I know you, and you are good. That's what he says to her, He says, it doesn't matter if you're Samaritan or Jewish, only that God seeks folks who worship with truth and spirit. She has shown spirit, she has told the truth. That's all he says to her. You are good. I see you, God needs you, and you are enough. And look what happens for her. She forgets the things that she worried about before. She leaves her pail. Jesus can get his own water, thank you very much. And she runs back to her town and to her community, and they receive her. They receive not just her, but the truth of her. Right? All those things that she thought were keeping them separate, that were keeping her separate. They disappear. That little bit of bravery, to heck with being alone, even though it's more comfortable. And suddenly she knows who she is again. She is affirmed in who she is again. She is okay. They don't just believe her, they believe in her. They are changed because of her. Now, the chapter we are currently reading in Brené Brown's book, she calls it High Lonesome, after a musical style. And in all of her work, I have seen very few chapters that seem as sad and as worried as this one. The flags are flying, she says, from every porch, and social media memes are trending, all while fear is burrowing and metastasizing. What feels like a rallying movement is usually a cover for fear. And as fear hardens, it expands, and it becomes less of a protective barrier and more of a solidifying division. Our three greatest fault lines, she continues, are cracks that have grown and deepened due to willful neglect and a collective lack of courage. Race, gender, and class. Our lack of tolerance for vulnerable, tough conversations is driving our self-sorting and disconnection. So can we find a way back to ourselves and to each other and still keep fighting for what we believe in? No and yes, is what she answers. No and yes. But if we're not even willing to try, the very value of what we're fighting for is profoundly diminished. We are shrinking into ourselves into isolated, often irritable versions of ourselves. So here's the thing, all of this talk about belonging, it's for you. It really is, because these versions of ourselves, they're not working. So we're doing this work so that you know you belong firmly, are part of the miracle of Christ still unfolding in the world. And once you know that, it is our vocation as followers of Jesus to do what he did, which is to say, to show up. To linger where custom says maybe you might not be welcome. To engage one another in conversation. To love others, even if you don't want to. Because you just might find Jesus. You just might find yourself. And together, we might just change your little corner of the world. That's how it works. Thanks be to God.